Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Now, you may have noticed that tonight's show looks slightly different. That's because Sharaad and I will continue to broadcast the show as we work from home. And tonight, we will be speaking to the co-editors of the recently launched book titled Sabah From The Ground, the 2020 Elections and the Politics of Survival. Now, this book is a study on Sabah's elections last year, what happened and why, as well as the broader implications of the outcome for Sabah and Malaysian politics. Now, the first co-editor that's going to join us on the show tonight is Bridget Welsh, who also authored several chapters in the book. Bridget, good evening. Thank you for being on the show with us. In the introduction of this book, it's noted that the explanations of Sabah politics often focus on ethnic and state nationalism. So I'm wondering why you think that is a limiting approach. Help us understand why this approach is not the only approach or the only lens from which to view Sabah politics.
There's two parts of it, right? So people, the focus on ethnic politics ignores other aspects of people's identity, issues of class, issues of generational cohort, where people live within parts of an area, such as regionalism. And so therefore, the ethnic focus really just ignores other aspects of people's living in terms of the context of why they may vote for different candidates or not. And at the other aspect of this, the focus on state nationalism, really looks at the focus in the debate at the elite level for most Sabahans. The idea is the relationship between the federal government and the state and Sabah. But the fact of the matter is, for most ordinary people, they're focused on the issues of managing their ordinary lives, for their family, for the economy. They're not necessarily thinking about the federal government. So I think these particular approaches, while are important, they should not be exclusive to understanding what's happening in Sabah.
If you can help us address that issue about, and I think it's brought up in in part in the book itself, about the dearth of research and writing on Sabah. You mentioned some works of note, like Herman Luping's book that remains banned, I understand. Why has Sabah not attracted more research and more analysis, considering the very curious complexities that differ from the national narrative?
I think in some ways it's the complexities themselves that often become an obstacle for people to try to understand, which in fact it should be exactly as you suggested, the opposite, that people should begin to learn and to explore Sabah. And I think there are good scholarship on Sabah, but it's not necessarily focused on political behavior and understanding politics. And I think that what the whole book aims to do is to kind of continue and expand the discussion and the analysis of these issues, and to build a stronger foundation for these conversations.
Right, Bridget, could you come back to that the earlier answer about not just looking at Sabah through the lens of an ethnic focus and state nationalism? How should we be then looking at Sabah? How should we be understanding in a more holistic manner?
I think there are a few very important things that come out of the book and these conversations by a whole series of authors. The first of which is that Sabah has a very different social, ethnic, and composition. So it's not just the ethnic communities, but also the conditions that they're living in. You have almost 1 out of 5 households are poor, and these are really very big, serious challenges for Sabah, and this I think is important for understanding why there is poverty, what are the dynamics behind it. Part of that population, large sections of Sabah, more than half of it are rural, and I think these issues need to be looked at. The other dimensions of this is that Sabah has particular issues to Sabah, which of course have to do with the issues of undocumented persons or what people call PTI or PATI or illegal communities, but they're actually, many of them, most of them are undocumented. And this sets of issues has been highly politicized over time. And it's not, and it's much more potent and it's much more serious in Sabah than anywhere else in the country. So as a consequence, this issue shapes the state's politics in very different sets of ways. And I think the third issue has to do with Sabah, has to do with the issues of governance, in the sense that there is serious obstacles in terms of access to healthcare, even access to education for some of the people in the very rural areas, access to other basic services. And those issues affect the way people engage the political system because they think about voting in terms of being able to access services or to improve their livelihoods, where in other parts of Malaysia, many of these services are provided, so they make different sets of choices.
Bridget, this is an exceptionally large book. I mean, since it, in terms of its ambitions, it's over 350 pages long and covers everything from youth politics to the question of unemployment. But I was intrigued by the two forwards provided in the book, one by Bernard Dompo and Saleh Said Krua, both of those well-known names when we think of Saban politics. What I thought was quite interesting in both the forwards is a sense that Sabahans, at least these two individuals, believe that there's something for the rest of the country to learn from Sabah. It's not simply that we're looking at Sabah as it were, a marginal space in the country for which, things have, there are a lot of deprivations and you know the politics of resentment, but also that there's something positive to learn from Sabah. Could you help us understand what that might be?
Oh, I think it's very important to learn from Sabah because there's a much more civil discourse among people, even within the political competition, and it is heated. But the fact is that there isn't the same level of acrimony and the same level of polarization to this that is mobilized to the same degree as it is in the rest of Malaysia. And even ethnic politics is actually, while significantly important, it's not as divisive in terms of the way that it is actually practiced in terms of and politicized in terms of the way it on the ground. And so I think these are some of the issues that people talk about, the way that politics is carried out, the types of issues and discourse on the ground, and the fact that there is also, I think, more recognition and discussions of some of the challenges. And I think that the issues in terms of governance and others are very pertinent. Now, while many of the politicians didn't necessarily focus on them, I think many of the individuals, in terms of their interests and how they voted, these were very much on their radar.
Right. And you looked at voting patterns during the last elections. Bridget, what can you tell us about what you've learned looking at voting behavior from the 2020 Sabah elections?
So there are three things I would emphasize. The first is that that while ethnicity is important in Sabah, it is not the only factor that is actually shaping voting behavior. And what we saw in particular, that class voting was important. Those have lower incomes were switched their support compared to 2018 in 2020, and that is something that actually helped GRS to win in the election. Also, along with that was the importance of gender as a factor of, that underscores voting patterns over time. And so in the need to look at these other factors beyond the issues of just looking at ethnicity is an important dimension. The second big finding is that the voter electorate in Sabah is still polarized, like the way it is in the rest of Malaysia. And I think that many of the people who voted for Pakatan Harapan Party parties, and particularly in the case of Sabah Warasan, they still stayed loyal to Warasan. And I think that this was also the case for parties that had previously voted for BN and also in this time for BN GRS. So what we see is a situation where there's still quite divisions within the electorate, and people were loyal to those particular patterns. And the third issue that we see in the voting patterns is that we see a situation where there is now a new group of people coming in, younger voters. And what happened in Sabah is that many of them still are not registered, and only around half of them came out. But they are very important, and they're going to drive Sabah politics as they are going to drive the nation's politics. And I think this is where the issues of youth become crucial. And this is one of the reasons why we have at least 2 chapters on youth in this book.
Okay, Bridget, thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight. Unfortunately, we're about to go to break, but we want to thank you so much for being on the show and highlighting some of the insights that you shared in the book. Congratulations on the book once again. We're going to take a quick break here on Consider This, and we will be back with more, so stay tuned. Hi, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan. If you've just joined us on the show, we're discussing the recently published analysis of last year's Sabah elections. The book was co-edited by Bridget Welsh, who we just spoke to a bit earlier, Benjamin Loh, and Vilashini Somiah, titled Sabah From The Ground, the 2020 Elections and the Politics of Survival. Vilashini joins us now. She is an anthropologist and senior lecturer at the Gender Studies program at University of Malaya. Vila, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for joining us. So in this book, you co-authored a chapter titled Incessant Political Narratives, Perilous Migrants and the Treacherous East. And you co-authored that with Aslam Abdul Jalil. Within this chapter, Vila, it was interesting because you looked at how anti-migrant messaging was deployed during the Sabah election campaign period. I'm wondering why you thought this dimension of the campaign was important to study.
Thank you so much. And you know, guys, thanks so much for giving us the time of day to really discuss this book. Really a labor of love from all 3 of us. So I've worked on migrant issues in Sabah for over a decade. And really, one of the things that I've always been very fascinated by is the way in which division, or the conversation of division, is sort of used in very different ways. It's teased out in very many different ways. In the recent or in the last state election that we had, this was, of course, utilized and I think targeted very differently depending on the kind of communities you came from. So, of course, Aslam, my co-writer, was situated in parts of the East Coast, and I was over in Kota Kinabalu, where I vote. And really, I think when we came back with all this data, it was as if there were 2 very different campaigns that was running between the East and the West Coast. And that one common denominator was really the way in which migrant issues were discussed and, you know, used as ammunition, political ammunition, to sort of divide and conquer, really depending. And it was a good way to sort of have a feel of the ground in the different ways people reacted to this sort of anti-migrant messages.
Vila, because you're an anthropologist, I guess your primary focus is the way in which people make meaning of the messages out there, what they see in the world, and they're not necessarily coherent, or they don't take a step back as say, a political analyst or an anthropologist like yourself might do, right? So what is it that you're discovering, and what kind of conclusions can we draw from it in terms of people's political behavior?
Well, that's a fantastic question. You know, I repeat this to everybody who sort of asks me that question. Sabah is more than just Kota Kinabalu. Sabah is, so like Sarawak, of course, Sabah is so incredibly complex, and there's beauty in that complexity. Different people occupy different parts of Sabah because they are influenced by different cultures, different parts of the ASEAN neighborhood, and the way in which they sort of live their lives really tells us about heritages and the sort of celebration of these heritages that come from different places. Why it is that the migrant message is so strong and powerful, because it talks about a disunity between people, especially from a political lens, right? It tells us that up top, a lot of politicians sort of run with this particular message because it gives them the most obvious, the most direct way of seeing this division. And it's easy for them to sort of target different communities depending on it. Over in the East Coast, for example, many of the residents, or I would say all the residents that live in that part of the coast, share similar heritages with people who live in southern Philippines or parts of Indonesia, Kalimantan, for example, right? This is different from the other parts of Sabah simply because of the geography. Now, if we sort of look at that and we say, well, this is to be expected. People come from many different directions of the world and they resettle, and the diaspora works in that way, and borders, modern day borders coming in and sort of cutting a line across people would obviously mean that we have to pay respect to these differences in culture and in tradition. But in Sabah, it really just tells us that people are fighting for a kind of equality and a kind of recognition, which means that it's seen as limited. And therefore, pointing out that these differences are tied into stranger danger, the threat of the outsider, is the easiest way to go. You sow fear.
Right. Villa, could I ask you, I mean, this anti-migrant rhetoric that you speak of, is that similar to what we're seeing in Peninsular Malaysia? Are there parallels to be drawn? Is it equivalent?
Well, obviously there are overlaps, right? Especially in a time of COVID-19. And this book really is also, written with that in mind, that so many people have suffered from this pandemic, that your fears and your insecurities are exacerbated because the times have become so incredibly trying and difficult, right? So of course there are overlaps. What happened a little less than a year ago with, say, the Rohingya community it shows us that people are incredibly frightened and threatened. They don't know where their next meal is coming from. So in that aspect, there are overlaps, right? People sort of see, or they question their position in society, whether they still they have importance in the larger socio-political context. But where Sabah is a little bit different is because there's decades and decades to the sort of conversation and narratives that come from this anti-migrant messaging that we see happening in 2020 going on into 2021. And so because of that, with the sort of changes and the evolution to that message, we tend to lose track. We forget sometimes that this isn't a new message. It doesn't come up overnight. It happens from years and years of creation of narratives and a very turbulent political climate.
Right. Villa, thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight and sharing some of your perspectives on co-authoring those chapters. We appreciate your time. That was Vilashini Somiah, co-editor of Sabah From The Ground. After this, we're going to take a look at the lessons that were learned from the role of social media in the Sabah elections. So stay tuned to consider this. Hi, thanks so much for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. If you've just joined the show, we're discussing the recently launched Sabah From The Ground, the 2020 elections and the politics of survival. It's a book that looks at the broader implications of last year's elections for Sabah, as well as the broader Malaysian politics. Now, Benjamin Y.H. Low co-edited the book. He also co-wrote the chapter, Don't Jump, Time to Work, Political Maturity of Sabahan Digital Spaces Through the 2020 state elections. And Benjamin joins us on the show tonight. Ben, thank you so much for being here. Now, what did your study of social media as used particularly by Sabahans during the elections, what did that demonstrate to you in terms of behavior?
Hi, thank you very much for having me on the show. My study was very, very simple. So I'm a digital ethnographer by training. I basically examine how people behave in online spaces, in particular with regards to how people talk about political issues on social media and whatnot. So when the Sabah elections came around, that was a very unique opportunity for me to really sort of study Sabah almost as a microcosm of itself, whereby there's really nothing else to compete. Because normally you would always see Sabah elections would always be coincide with the general election. So it's very difficult to sort of study sort of like a mini culture in itself. So this was an excellent opportunity to sort of examine here as well. And as a result of that, what I found in the Sabah online social media spaces is that it's actually quite vibrant. People do actually engage quite a bit. You know, you've got people on various political sides talking about these issues. They really raise up a lot of these things that are associated with the side that they like to win. They would talk about, you know, the successes of the governments or the old governments. And they also sort of like use a lot of like smear tactics to go against the opponents that they feel are not worthy of being in government. So that was sort of like the general trends. On the surface, it looks very similar to what we have in Malaysia, but later on, we found that, you know, on deeper analysis, that there's actually some very, very important differences that differentiate how it works in Sabah compared to how it works on Peninsular Malaysia, essentially.
Benjamin, why did you frame the discussion of digital space in terms of political material? It seems to be a conceptual framework that you use. Why?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. You cut off a little bit there.
You use the concept of political maturity.
I see. Okay. So political maturity was actually a theme that emerged from the data that we looked at. So generally speaking, whenever you see a lot of these online media spaces, especially within the Malaysian elections, particularly whether it was in GE14 or in any of the by-elections that took place over the last couple of years, the trend that I always found was that no matter what happens, no matter who wins, the political rhetoric from the discussions tends to always be very, very divisive. You know, people basically go into polemics and they essentially just double down on whichever side they support. Whereas in the Sabah space, while that was happening during the campaign period, I noticed was that my co-author noticed was that we found that after the elections is over, people actually started to adopt this more sort of like objective approach, whereby they would say that, oh, the elections are already over. We don't really have to continue this, you know, this bitter rivalry or fighting. We should actually just focus on building up Sabah or making Sabah better as a result of this. And this was actually very, very refreshing. And I think this was something that me and my co-author didn't expect to get out of this data, because, you know, after sort of like looking at how Malaysia has been all this while, it tends to make you feel very, very cynical. But this was actually quite interesting. And yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very valid point. You would think that social media, particularly during a campaign period and immediately after, would be very polarizing, almost toxic in its nature. But it's refreshing to hear that that was not the case. Can you, I guess, you know, share with us reasons perhaps behind why you think that is particular to Sabahans?
I don't know. I mean, there were a lot. I mean, I'm not a Sabahan, so I'm your stereotypical. I'm very, very close to the sort of like the status quo center of Malaysia. You know, I'm ethnically Chinese. I'm from the Klang Valley area. I grew up here and whatnot. So for me to sort of study Sabah, I really was sort of like, I mean, I was given this rare opportunity to really sort of like learn about this space and sort of like employ my expertise to sort of study in a way that can actually do the area justice, and to also sort of like shed some light on these very, very new and novel ways of looking at politics. And I suppose the reason I use the term maturity is that, you know, Sabah has had a very, very long history of having a lot of these political defections, and this is not the first time the state has had a state election as a result of, you know, a change in the state government and whatnot. And so I believe that, you know, the argument that on the one hand, you always say that, oh, Sabah always has this problem because, you constantly have people who jump from political parties. And as a result of that, people can feel a little bit pessimistic overall. But for me, I think that when this situation does happen quite often, people actually start to think very carefully that, okay, I can support people in a certain political parties to a certain degree, but at a certain point that you actually need to you understand that having that die-hard fanaticism towards a political party can only go so far. And when you've seen, the administration powers change every now and then, it allows you to take a step back and see how we can actually move forward together. Because it almost becomes kind of like, you can sort of look at things in a certain way. You've got some perspective that tells you that not only one political party can get things done, that others can also do things in a certain way. And with that view in mind, I noticed that when people, so a lot of the discussions that took place after the elections was that the people who supported the winning side essentially were sort of like trying, everybody basically came together and said that, okay, your side won already. You need to start getting things done, which is why that was the sort of like the title for my chapter. Time to work, essentially. And so So one thing that I also bring up in my chapter is this idea of cyber trooper interference. This is something that as a social media scholar, this is something that has been incredibly toxic and poisonous for the Malaysian political space. And online political spaces especially.
Yeah, Ben, that is, further for an entire other show where we could talk another half an hour about just cyber troopers and that dimension of social media. But for tonight, we've run out of time, and want to thank you for being on the show with us. We appreciate your insights. Thank you.
Okay.
That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. But before we leave you, a quick reminder, don't forget to get the latest news and information on COVID-19 vaccines on astroawani.com and the Astro Awani app. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
We will be back with you same time on Monday. Till then, have a great weekend, folks. Good night.
Good night.